I am Dave Moss. I'm the founder of Unfunded List, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to a virtual symposium on inclusive philanthropy. In just a few short weeks, we'll be sending out feedback reports to a bunch of proposal authors who have asked us for feedback. And I'll be having report discussions with most of those folks to go over the feedback and help them as they try to be included in the world of philanthropy. Philanthropy is kind of having a moment, and more people are participating in it. Including a lot of you. And whether you've just joined a giving circle, or you've inherited a trust, or taken a job at a foundation, or as a grant writer, or if you're an unfunded list evaluator, most of you are, welcome. And I think these conversations will be helpful to you. So let's get the first one started. Margaret, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. My name is Margaret Chapman. I'm Managing Director of the Unfunded List. And today we're going to be discussing possibly one of the more convoluted topics of nonprofit management, and that is the public support test. So next slide. Okay. Excellent. As mentioned, I've been working with the Unfunded List for about 6 years now, since 2016. Wow. My background is in finance, operations. I've worked with a bunch of nonprofits, from small startups averaging about $50,000 a year in budget to the Pew Charitable Trusts, which averages $6 billion a year in their revenues. So it's a wide range. And a lot of them have had to deal with this test. Um, Full disclaimer, I do have a background in finance and all those things. I am not an accountant. I am not an attorney. I don't play one on TV or on webinars or on stage anywhere. So this is a conversation really at the 30,000 foot level about this topic. If you do have specific questions about your organization and their passage of this test, definitely speak to your own accountants, anyone who does your 990 for you, and work with them on figuring out your own specifics for the public support test. Also joining me today, so next slide. Oh, that's right. So, sorry, I removed that one out. So, joining me today is Amanda Liaw from the Catalogue of Philanthropy, and you'll be hearing from her in a little bit as well. But first, I'm going to do a kind of, like I said, 30,000 foot overview of the public support test. It is really one of the more, I use the word convoluted because it's not even really complicated math. The math behind it is addition, subtraction, and division. It's convoluted because there are so many pieces to it that might apply to you. They might not apply to you. They might apply to you last year and not this year. Um, it really is just one of those things that everyone has to deal with. And if you find someone who is an expert on it, stick with them. Um, they're complex, and it's not even just me or anyone on this call noting that they're complex. We have folks at the IRS and in all levels of government who acknowledge that this is perhaps one of the more convoluted and complex concepts of running a nonprofit. Um, Essentially, what happens is you have to show that your organization is being supported by the public, right? You're operating for the public good. And we have to make sure that the funds you're receiving reflect that. So, like I said, the math is not super complicated. You have your numerator, and which is your total support for the year, and your denominator, which is how much comes from the public. And when you do that simple math, if the number is over 33.33%, you pass. If the number is between 10 and 33.33%, you fall in this kind of not quite passing, but can pass if you have other scenarios kind of situation. If you fall below 10% and you can't pass these other circumstances, you could lose your public charity status. What does that mean? That means that you become a private foundation. donations are no longer tax deductible. You may be subject to excise taxes or other taxes that, as a public charity, you don't have to worry about. Um, Most of the organizations, one of the reasons they want to pass this is because they do want to be able to have their donations be tax deductible, and get those tax exemptions. So it's a really big step every year for organizations to pass this test, because they want to make sure that they can continue telling their donors that they qualify and that their donations qualify to be written off. So, next slide, please. Who qualifies to have to complete the public support test? Well, most of your 501c3 organizations, and we won't get into the numerous types of organizations that could fall in that C3 thing, but you're probably looking mostly at your traditional nonprofits. That's where a lot of you are probably working. Churches, schools, regular support organizations, government units. The second type, which are the kind of gross receipts organizations, these are the ones where it gets a little hairy, because a lot of the receipts may come from admissions and sales, thinking, tickets, anything that you're selling. So, one of those things really can throw off your public support test. Um, instead of just getting donations and grants, you also have this third type of income where you're selling something and receiving income from it, and that can potentially, throw off and put you in another frame of mind for your public support test. We also have the supporting organizations. This is an interesting one, because it's essentially one organization has said we need to create something else to complete our mission. And so they create a supporting organization. Um, they're not necessarily publicly supported, because they're supported by the organization where they originated. It's kind of like a spinoff. Think of it as spinoff for nonprofits. Um, and then you have a very specific public safety organization. So any organization that is protecting the public in any way. All of these folks have to spill out this public support test, right? So it kind of hits most of the organizations that are out there across the board. You have to fill this out at some point in time when you're doing your 990. What do we mean, like, when we look at the public support test? If we can kind of go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. Is that better? Awesome. So, like I mentioned, in terms of the math, it's not a complicated equation. It is addition. Let's add up all of the support we received this year and throw it in the top. Let's add up all of the amount that came from the public. Great, just addition. And then we're just going to divide those two numbers and we get a percentage. Pretty straightforward, right? Until you start to fill in what goes into those two numbers and what numbers you're adding up. Um, we can look at the unfunded list as an example. It's interesting because this year, when we do our 990 for 2022, will actually be the first year where we actually have to complete this test. You get a bit of a buy for the first 5 years, where you don't have to actually complete this test. They give you 5 years to kind of get things figured out until you have to actually do the math. There's a little checkbox just for everybody who's doing their 990 next year and you're in your first 5 years. There's a little checkbox literally there. You just say, yes, we're in the first 5 years. We don't need to do this math. Please take advantage of that. Please know it's there. And when we're doing this, it seems simple enough. We just add up everything we got and then divide it by everything that's public support. But when you start getting into it, there are so many things that might count as support, that might count as public support. with the unfunded list, the fees we charge for the organizations to receive feedback. That's one that's kind of a toss up as to whether or not it gets included. Is that public support? Is that support? Is that a payment for a service? Um, there's so many little nuances about what parts of your income get counted as support or public support. When we look at that, we think of grants. Certain grants are included and certain grants are excluded, depending on whether or not um, they get counted. So, here at the unfunded list, we do believe that we will pass this year. It will be the first year we have to prove it, but we are hopeful that it will not be an issue for us to pass this test. We actually have tried to do it a little bit along the way during the year to kind of take stock and make sure that it doesn't look like it's going to be an issue, but we fully expect to pass this year. And if we fall into that category where we're under 33%, but over 10%, we can pass because of something called facts and circumstances, which is the next slide. Yay! So let's say unfunded list does fall into that kind of gap, right? We're under 33, we're above 10. What does that mean? That means that we can still pass if we can prove that we hit some of these facts and circumstances. Um, our events are free to the public. We have, again, it all goes back to are we improving the public, right? We are a public charity. We have to prove that we support the public and they support us. So we do that by proving the various things that we do for the public. Our events are free. Our online library is free. We have a lot of resources that we share with the public. We do have a board of directors. That is actually one of the facts and circumstances is do you have a board of directors and a guidelines and bylaws uh, covering them? We do. We also have committees and a lot of folks who have special knowledge in the area of philanthropy, which is what we say our mission rides on. We provide education about philanthropy to the public. Our board is full of people who understand that and do that. We solicit donations. Just the fact that we solicit donations can be a fact and circumstance to help us pass the public support test. We do that. There's a button on our website. You'll hear about it in a minute and all the ways that you can help with that. We also apply for a lot of grants. We do have charitable solicitation licenses. And we receive a lot of our funding from other public charities, right? So all of you guys who support us by giving us their submission fees, a lot of you are also public charities and therefore help us pass our test by being a public charity that supports us and can allow us to maintain our public charity status. I did talk about the concept of grants that may or may not be counted. There's this kind of wonky scenario where they are called unusual grants. If they are multi-year or help you support the public in their function, there's a whole string of things that if the grant falls into one of those categories are considered unusual. When you start to read it, it kind of makes you wonder if all grants are unusual because so many of them fall into those categories. At which point, what's a usual grant? But that can also be something that can help an organization pass their public support test because these unusual grants don't get counted the same way as the total support. So, like I said, this is a pretty massive topic. And I literally just read, Dave downloaded, and I was able to read a rather lengthy document that walked through all of the nuts and bolts around this topic, and I still have questions. I still have it kind of highlighted with some notes about how this might pertain to the unfunded list and how we might use it or take advantage of something, or maybe some we include something in the last year we didn't need to. All of these things, um, all of which is to say, if, if you have someone that you work with on your 990, sit down with them early to start working on passing your public support test, because the math seems intuitive. It seems like it should be pretty straightforward. But once you really start digging into all of the pieces that could go into those two numbers, um, depending on what you count or don't count, your percentage could be vastly different. You know, if we include one grant in one scenario, we could have a 50% percentage. If we take that out because it's considered not applicable, all of a sudden we're down to 5%, right? So, really make sure that you take the time um, to work with your accountant or whomever is doing your 990 to think through how all of the different pieces apply to you, so that you feel confident that you are passing the public support test accurately. And again, we're going to take some questions. We're going to have a lot more conversation about this. But before that, I believe we have a word from our sponsor, the Unfunded List.
Next slide. I made a whole slide for this. Here we go. Hey, it's me. Like Margaret just said, in order to pass public support test, one of the things that we may say is that we solicit donations, and I'm about to do that. Some of you have already been quite generous, and thank you very much for that. Some of you, it would not be helpful. Like my mother, for instance, is on the call. A large contribution from you will not help us pass the public support test. The IRS will be like, well, this lady's related to you, and possibly just funneling money through. So it's very important that we receive public support, and don't let this fancy plate fool you. Mosses are not like some rich billionaires, right? Even if it weren't for this test, we wouldn't be able to pay for everything. I'm very lucky to have a lot of support, like Margaret Chapman as our managing director. We also have Arshak and David and Alex on the call, and there's several other people who help us out. Occasionally there are costs, and donations from evaluators and folks who attend our events are how we pay those costs. They are tax deductible, and if you make it between now and the end of the year, you'll help us pass the public support test. Currently, we are just over 33%, I think. Last time I ran the little calculator. I think we're going to get some more donations, hopefully from some of you. And thank you in advance for those. I said I'd keep it brief, and for today, I'll keep my word. Like Margaret said, there's a donate button on our website, but I'm happy to answer any questions in advance if you want to talk to me. You'll hear from me more. I'm moderating the 2 sessions later, but for now, back to our public support panelists. Excuse me, Margaret and Amanda. You're doing a great job so far.
Thanks. Fantastic. So I kind of teased that she was coming, and now here she is. So thank you guys for listening to all of that. But really, there's a lot of theoretical stuff we just talked to very quickly. So I kind of want to get a little bit more into the weeds about what does it mean for the day-to-day life of someone working in a nonprofit. And for that, we have the amazing Amanda Liaw from the Catalogue for Philanthropy. So I'm going to turn it over to her for a couple minutes to talk about herself and the work that she does there, and then we'll jump into a couple questions.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. And thank you, Dave. Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Liaw. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm very excited to be here today as part of this symposium. So thank you again for inviting me. Before I kind of get started, I just want to share a note up front that I am in an office with very aggressive, eco-friendly lighting. So if you see me do this, it's so that I can bring the lights back on. But I'll get started just by sharing a little bit about myself. So what I'm currently doing, how I got here, and then I've been invited to speak a little about what public support means to me. And then I can dive into the work of the Catalogue for Philanthropy as it relates to public support before going to what Margaret said, the next part of our conversation. So at the moment, I'm currently based in the DC area. I believe I first heard about the unfunded list through the Next Gen Giving Circle, which is a giving circle here in the DMV that I've been a part of for 2 years. I know that one of the founders, Peter Williamson, is on the board of the unfunded list. And I had the chance to volunteer with Unfunded as an evaluator. So I will say that it is one of the reasons why I've gotten a chance to learn more about nonprofits and philanthropy since I first moved here, especially about nonprofits locally, which is really important to me and that I will touch on later. So a bit about my background. I was born in Singapore. That's where I grew up until I was about 18. So I only moved to the United States 6 or 7 years ago at this point. I was in Los Angeles, where David Jaffe is now, and I was learning to be a filmmaker, which is what I thought I wanted to be at the time. I have always been interested in storytelling as a practice, and I think it was only halfway or 3/4 of the way through film school when I was trying to figure out, why do I want to tell stories? What stories do I want to tell? That I started challenging myself and asked more of the larger scale questions that I still explore in my work. So what are the stories we tell ourselves, and how do these stories impact the ways in which we think it's possible to live and to live well with other people? So once I started asking myself these questions, for me, that's when I realized it wasn't enough for me to try to make films in response to these questions. I really wanted to learn from and join the people who have been making a difference, like a real concrete difference in these areas. I wanted to learn about the existing realities that are happening and have been happening. So before graduating, I decided to explore the social impact sector. I had the chance to intern with the Goldhirsch Foundation, which runs the LA 2050 grant making initiative. And through a professor, I also learned a little more about social enterprises as a model for social impact. So really the first job that I held at a nonprofit was when I moved to DC in 2020 during the pandemic. It was with the Penn Faulkner Foundation. I know, great time to move. But it was with the Penn Faulkner Foundation, which is a local literary arts organization here in DC and is one of the nonprofit partners for the Catalogue. So that's how I first learned about the Catalogue, which is where I am now. I joined in February and I do communications, marketing, and community engagement events with them. Just because it's really top of mind, I also help to run their the region's Giving Tuesday campaign as one of their official partners. So I will note, even pretty early on into my first job at a nonprofit, I realized there's no field without its flaws, right? And there are certainly, like, philanthropy is not an exception. I learned pretty quickly that there are still a lot of systemic inequities that are specific to this context and to this field. But at the same time, there's also a lot of meaning to be found and a lot of camaraderie. There are so many people who have been doing this work since, frankly, before I was even born. So there's a lot of people, a lot of history to learn from, and that's why I'm still really interested in continuing to explore the questions that I have in this field. And I think related to the Catalogue, so many of my reasons for joining are aligned with my passion for what the Catalogue does. So I think I'm very fortunate in that sense that I can explore this professionally and really talk about how to change systems for the better, what it actually means to be doing that. So the questions that we'll explore today in the session about public support and what that means, I find them really interesting because, unlike Margaret, my experience is not necessarily in like the technical operations or financial or legal management of nonprofits, but I do think a lot every day about why somebody would support a nonprofit. How do nonprofits then build community with their supporters? And ultimately, because we're still trying to get to a world where we value people over profits, whose hearts are we trying to change so that we can get there? At my role, I amplify the work of the nonprofits that are in our network, what they do. I try to connect them with community members that are in the region. So these kinds of questions are really present in my day-to-day. So at the risk of sounding like I'm going to be a little bit vague with my words, I I think that for me, public support essentially boils down to two things. The first is community, and the second is story. So these two things for me are really deeply intertwined. And I think it's in the question itself, right? What does it mean to be a public? And what does it mean to make a case for support? So for the first, community, and I say this knowing that my opinion is continually evolving, but I think that change always comes from and starts with the people. And what that looks like is that even as we try to analyze systems on a larger scale, I think that the first step we take towards that tends to be rooted in our experience on a community level. So if we're living in a world that all of us love, I don't know if nonprofits would necessarily have to exist, at least not in the form and the structure and the intention that they currently take. And we wouldn't need to do what we think of now as wealth redistribution, right? But instead, what we do have are a lot of communities who feel a need so acutely that something has to change. And at this point, I think the questions become, what do you feel is the change that needs to happen, and how do you propose bringing about that change? And as you grow with these questions, that's where the more intentional storytelling element in trying to make a case for others to support you comes in. Why do you do what you do? Why does it matter that you're doing this? And if you have the support of a broader community, what difference do you think that can make? So I speak on this with my experience with the Next Gen Giving Circle too. The grant making process, I've learned a lot through that. And we talk a lot about, if we really want to redistribute resources to community-led efforts, we need to start with acknowledging that we share that responsibility as people who are asking others to tell their stories. And secondly, the how of the ask is also really important, because storytelling forms, storytelling structures are very different for different people, especially for small nonprofits. They may not have the time or the resources or the experience of writing an application and telling their story in that way. So I think that's part of the equity of access that we're all continually trying to improve on. And then you get to the question, whose stories do you give more weight to and why? And that's not an easy question. And I know a lot of us deal with that as well. So with that, I would love to share a little more about what the Catalogue does, especially for those who aren't already familiar with us. The Catalogue for Philanthropy is a small nonprofit ourselves. We're actually celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. Woo! We are DC's only local guide to civic engagement, and we are the only provider of capacity building resources that are specifically targeted to small and medium-sized nonprofits. So we have a network of more than 400 nonprofits in DC, as well as in nearby Maryland and Virginia. And these are chosen by a team of more than 150 community advocates every year. So there are people who work here, who live here, who are, who care about the communities that are here. Similarly to Unfunded, actually, we do a training for our team of advocates, and then we have them qualitatively evaluate and share their thoughts on the nonprofits that apply to be part of our network. And for us, this process is really to ensure that, for the nonprofits to join us, it's not just a unilateral decision on our part, right? Like, it's actually based on the thoughts and the experiences of the community members who are here. So as part of the application process, we pay attention particularly to the uniqueness of a nonprofit, the need that it's meeting, and most importantly, the critical local impact that it's making. And then every year, we accept about 80 or so nonprofits in our new class for a total of a 4-year partnership. And like Unfunded, we do provide feedback to nonprofits on their applications when they request it. It's actually interesting. We found that we tend to be the first organization they've applied to that will provide this feedback to them in depth. And we've heard that it's really useful, right? Like, having worked on the development side of a nonprofit, I can't tell you how invaluable it is to be like, okay, somebody is going to tell me, how I can improve on this in the future, actually take the time and the attention to work on the storytelling skills for future applications. So we appreciate that there is an organization like Unfunded that does this work, because it's really important. But yeah, once nonprofits enter into a partnership with us, we provide them with tools, resources, and support, all at no cost to them over the 4 years. So we're not a grant-making organization ourselves, but through the reach of the catalog, we help our partners raise a little over $2 million every year. And we ourselves train more than 5,000 nonprofit professionals a year. So what we're really trying to do is to build community with other small local nonprofits and to increase equity by lifting them up. Because when we say small, what we mean is organizations who have budgets of $100,000 to $4 million. About a third of our partners don't have dedicated development staff. About 2/3 don't have dedicated communication staff. So a lot of the times, there are tons of existing resources out there for nonprofits, but what we see is that they're not necessarily actionable or practical for nonprofits that say work on like small to none marketing budgets, right? Or have teams of 1 to 3 people. So as Margaret touched on earlier, right, with the IRS public support test and how important it is for nonprofits, so often we see that it's the small nonprofits especially that lack access to networks of funders, of donors, of supporters, of volunteers, of advocates. So that's why in all of the resources that we provide, something that we really want to be intentional about is making sure that it's not just us sharing best practices, but it's something that's going to be useful for them. So with that, we try to listen to their feedback, we try to co-create offerings with them, and we always want to be flexible with adapting to what they tell us that they need. I'll share a little bit about 2 of the programs that we've developed recently. The first is our Grassroots Accelerator program. So we created that for the smallest community-based organizations that are $250,000 budgets and under. And we prioritized especially budgets of $100,000 and under, as well as organizations that are based in wards 7 and 8 in DC, as well as in Prince George's County, Maryland, because those are the places that are under-resourced and that have historically been disinvested in. So the program itself is a 6-month cohort model where we really emphasize peer-to-peer learning so that, again, it's not just us sharing things, but it's about engaging leaders and skill building together. The relationships that they build are very important because, as we know, a network is important to have. And then we come in, we facilitate the sessions, we share some of the sustainable practices that we found to be helpful when considering growth and impact. And we actually recently concluded our inaugural cohort. So this is a very new program. And we're going to be publishing a piece with our reflections and our takeaways in the next week or so. The second program is a cohort similarly, but for emerging leaders of color. So specifically for junior executive directors or for senior staff who will be rising executive directors. And we facilitate these cohorts over 6 sessions in 3 months. And again, skill building together, but also specifically focused on conversations that are led by the experiences of leaders of color in this field. So the last thing I want to add before I pass it back to Margaret to continue on with the conversation. Personally, I want to share that I'm continually learning a lot through the catalog and here in DC that we're just like one part of a larger ecosystem of change, which I know a lot of people in the philanthropy space also feel. Especially locally, there are a lot of amazing mutual aid efforts, right? Small businesses and co-ops, advocacy groups. There are a lot of people who do great work, both within and outside of the 501c3 and the fiscal sponsorship models. At the same time, because I'm new to DC, because I'm really invested in making my home here, I can also see how there's a side of the city that feels like it can be really easy to move to a place like this and not get to know what the local issues are, not get to meet your neighbors, not get to learn about the history of this place. And especially for a city like DC, there are so many sources of information for national level news or national level issues. And the nonprofits that are larger, that have marketing budgets, that have public relations teams, those tend to then end up being top of mind for people when they think about giving back or about getting involved with a cause. Not to say like those aren't worthy of support, right? I'm sure they're doing great work, but this comes back to some of the questions I have about larger systemic change. I think that there is a lot to be said for the community building that small grassroots organizations do. And I think, honestly, too, that there is a lot of emotional impact that people can feel when they connect with the people around them who are doing good work, when they get involved with the kind of change that can happen on a local level. So as part of our 20th anniversary, the theme at the Catalogue this year is "The Future is Local." And I'm personally very passionate about that because I do think that that is a really good way to move forward together. So with that, I'll pass it back to Margaret to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you. That was awesome. I learned new things about the catalog today. So there's a couple of questions that I know Amanda and I are going to talk through. But also, if you guys have questions, feel free to use the hand raise feature. Full disclosure, I'm not sure we will actually be able to answer a lot of them, but we will take notes. And maybe it's someone else on the call will also have an answer that they may know something even more than we do. So, Amanda, you were talking about the, the application process. And this is a totally random question that was not anywhere. So I just made it up because I'm curious. As we're talking about the public support test and you're talking through the application process for the catalog, is that something that ever comes up, like especially for some of the smaller nonprofits that might want to get into the catalog? Is that a checkbox or do you happen to know of, that's something that comes up as part of the application process as a concern, or we're concerned they may not pass it down the road, or that they are fully supported by only one or two donors, so we may not accept them? Or is that not even a thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think this actually speaks to what you and Dave had talked about in putting the session together. I hadn't known about the public support test. I don't believe that it's part of our application process, although I may be wrong on that. I don't deal with the operations of that review. But I will say that as part of the application, we do look very closely at how engaged the nonprofits are with their communities, which I think speaks to a lot of what you talked about in passing the support test and making sure that, your funding sources are diversified, that you do have, a base of people that you engage with and that are a big part of the way in which you decide to do your work. But I have learned a lot about the public support test from you, even just today.
Yeah, I could see that being a factor, right? Because if you have, some of those smaller organizations that you were talking about, especially under the 250,000, and they're newer, maybe they're coming up on year 4 or 5, and they get accepted, and in the past it hasn't been an issue, but all of a sudden they're in year 6, and they've been accepted, and they only have 2 major donors, even though they might have a lot of support. Which is an interesting thought. And now it's a question that I feel like I need to spend time answering over the next few months for myself, because I'm curious.
Yeah.
So, the catalog does a lot in terms of in the public. And you talked a little bit about kind of how you ended up in the nonprofit sector and what the different publics are. But I'm curious kind of what it means to you that the public is supporting an organization. When we say that they've passed a public support test, it's a very mathematical, theoretical thing, but in a kind of perfect world example, what does it mean that an organization has public support behind it?
Yeah. That's a tough question that's always so dependent, I think, on the timing and on who you define your audience to be, right? But I will say part of my work is trying to engage the community. This is such a broad goal because it's like everybody in the DMV can be connected to local nonprofits in their neighborhoods and things like that. So then when we're thinking that through, what does that look like? I think that for us, going out into the community means actually showing up at the things that people are already doing and trying to figure out on a really small, hyper-local level, how do we align our work with each other? And I think that's kind of the advice that we also share with nonprofits based on what we've done. The first steps usually are get somebody to learn about you and what you do. When they follow you on social media, when they subscribe to your email list, that's a way for them to stay connected with you, and also a way for you to continue stewarding them so that they then end up being part of your pool of supporters. What that looks like depends on the needs of your organization at the time. So donations, always welcome, always encouraged, right? But there are a lot of our organizations, especially in arts and service, that look for volunteers, that look for in-kind donations, such as food banks, right? Homeless shelters, things like that. So those are all the different ways that people can offer their support. And then I think the other part of that is for nonprofits also not treating them as just transactions. What we really do is try to build a community of supporters. So we always kind of talk about stewardship. How do you make sure that not only are you thanking people, but that you're really involving people in the processes of your work? And I think that's kind of a way to build, in some sense, a pipeline for people to not only continue supporting, but to evolve their support to become like true advocates for your mission. And at the end of the day, the more people who believe in the work that you do and the vision that you're trying to manifest in this world, the easier it'll be to get there just naturally. So
yeah. I love when you started off and you were talking about the storytelling, because I do see how those two come together, the donations and the storytelling. And you might be listening and saying, well, that's marketing, or that's mission and programmatic and all that sort of thing. But it actually does tie very closely to, I think, the public support test, which seems very mathematical and kind of operational, because you can't really pass this one if you don't tell a good story, like you just mentioned. Having you get your donors from the public, and the public are the people who support you. They're the ones who you've brought along with your story and your mission and your programs, and they've become donors. So if you don't do a lot of that storytelling and really set the foundation for why people should care, then it is going to be harder to pass that test at the end of the day, because it's you have fewer donors. They're all one and the same. Jane, yes, a question. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry,
There you go.
incompetent technically. I'm sort of interested in and again, it's more of a general question in how the pandemic has affected, obviously it's affected ability to have public events and to actually get people together, and if that has affected the the kind of donations that will count for public support, and that and if the IRS is sort of giving everybody a pass on, like we got a pass on a lot of things, like, for us old people, mandatory withdrawals from our 401s. But has the IRS given 501c3s a pass on these issues?
It hasn't, that I know of. Again, you might know it's
Let's
differently.
check.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know for sure,
That
but
would be very nice.
I don't hear anything. I can't imagine that it has had a huge impact, because a lot of grant makers during the pandemic decided to continue funding the organizations they knew, right? So you might see the same funds coming in year after year from that same funder, because instead of opening it up to new grantees, they just decided to continue funding the organizations they already knew and were working with, because they thought they needed it during the pandemic. It also perhaps had a positive benefit, because so many people were giving more openly, just maybe not random organizations, but new organizations that they had never worked with before, because they saw the need and they were able to. So they just more openly donated across the board. It may have also cut back a little bit on some of the fee and sales that people were able to take in, which is one of those wonky numbers that sometimes gets counted and sometimes doesn't. So theaters, for example, weren't able to sell tickets, if at all, at least fewer tickets if they were doing limited seating. That has a direct impact on whether or not they can pass their public support test. Because they may have the same number of grants coming in, but they have more, fewer tickets that are coming in. So how does that affect their bottom line and that percentage? So I can imagine that the pandemic, from what I've seen, has had a huge impact on various pieces of where those different numbers are coming from. But now I do want to go look up if the IRS has done anything.
So yeah, I think we should look it up. But I will say that like I do want to pass. I'll add with because and I want to be tested as well. And the reason why is because there are scams. This is basically my general question here. All right, there's huge tax advantage to having the status that we have.
Yep.
So there are people who would try to take advantage of it. Like it happens. I can share there's some news articles on it. Some of these scams are in fact entirely legal. They just operate within the tax code. Is it something that Catalogue deals with? Like, do you like, right? Not everybody who just does the initial paperwork filing is a like legit organization. Do you have a process for? So we've even here received a couple scam stuff. It's usually pretty obvious once I read it.
Yeah, we have a financial review that's definitely part of the process. I don't think I could speak to that as well, just because that's not the area of the organization that I engage with. I think Margaret answered, and Dave also answered more so to like your question specifically, Jane, about like the IRS. But I know that just more generally, I had a chance to speak with one of the nonprofits in our network, Dreaming Out Loud, which is a Black-led farm and food hub that's here in the DMV. And I think one of the interesting things, like we know about how the pandemic has impacted, honestly, just every community, right? And that it's continuing to have very cumulative and very long-lasting effects on people, and disproportionately on people too. I think the thing that's interesting, especially when defining what public support means, and this gets a little bit more into the advocacy space, Dreaming Out Loud was sharing with us in an interview that we published on our blog that during the pandemic, there was kind of a moment there where equity became like the hot stuff, right? Like everybody was realizing how important it was to do. Everybody was realizing the need that was there. And I think now the challenge is, as we are starting to kind of come out of lockdown, out of, restrictions and things like that, events are starting to happen again. There's a real risk of people no longer considering that as part of their day-to-day lives because they're not experiencing it or they're not seeing it anymore. And with something like Dreaming Out Loud, I know one of the things that they really said was, you can have 100 Dreaming Out Louds, 100 nonprofits working on food justice and food advocacy and access. But really, a lot of this work is also something that the government needs to be able to take on. And so part of the ongoing effort is that, yes, we want to support nonprofits, and also we want to advocate for better policies so that it's not just nonprofits taking on that work. So.
Yeah.
I do get a lot of people who come to me and they ask, what can philanthropy do about this issue or this issue or this issue, right? And sometimes a lot, right? Other times, it's like, so a very common ones would be gun violence or climate change, right? And I imagine there's things philanthropy can do about those issues. But fundamentally, like your elected official needs to do something about those issues. And in fact, a lot of philanthropy dollars are going towards many things that government should be dealing with, and has sometimes. If you look at, we have a funder from Australia, and speaking later, right, their government has passed some gun control measures in response to school shootings, and so she, in her funding job, is not considering a whole lot of proposals, right, to provide like gun, right, bulletproof doors to schools, right, which is a proposal that we have read here, right, at Unfunded list. And Margaret alluded to this question earlier, and it's like a very big question. But what are the kinds of things that should be right in the public sector, right, and versus what should government or private solutions solve, right? Do you have any sort of line there that you draw? Either you or the catalog, I guess.
You're asking me. I will say at the catalog, because one of the big things that we value really is trying to bring about a more equitable and just region. We have nonprofits that we're very inspired by because of the coalition building that they do. So we have nonprofits in our network that push for advocacy, push for change together, right? Especially when, so much of the local change that happens is at city council, is part of the DC budget. We brought together some nonprofits for an online panel in June on how exactly to fight for things that you want to see in the city budget, which not a lot of people know about, not a lot of people think about that sort of thing, especially in DC, right? So we have, for instance, the Washington Area Bicyclist Association, the Legal Clinic for the Homeless. They're part of a larger fair budget coalition that's really working to push council members on certain issues so that you get funding in certain things. We have one of the new nonprofits in our network this year, the Mothers Outreach Network, that is part of the DC Guaranteed Income Coalition. And they actually, I believe, work with funders as well, like the IF Foundation, to try to bring about that change. So I think that there is definitely a big space for nonprofits and for funders to be part of that advocacy. And they're already doing that. So in that sense, we definitely support their work. But yeah, I mean, Margaret, I'm curious how you would answer this question, because I know like your models of social formation webinar where you talk about 501c4s and things too, like they're all different models for achieving different goals that end up hopefully kind of at the same place, right?
Yeah, I mean, I always love to have a conversation with an organization, and when they're thinking about their strategic planning, and I'm like, what, the end goal for you actually should be that you don't exist, right? Your end goal should be that no one needs you anymore. And that was one of my favorite lines when I worked with Street Sense, was when someone would say, what's your ideal for this organization? I'm like, that you don't need us because the problem has been solved, right? So I think there are a lot of things that the government can and should be doing. And philanthropy is trying to fill that gap, and sometimes doing it well, sometimes not. I will point you to the sometimes controversial but always outspoken Robert Egger, who recently has been speaking a lot on this topic, especially, and how nonprofits are trying to fill that gap. And because of especially some of the donor issues and just there's this lack of resources sometimes that is available, that where government can step in. So especially in areas around homelessness and food and some of those just basic amenities of life, where is the government supplying and supporting people to help make these less of an issue? And why do we need private donors and nonprofits to just provide a basic standard of living? So I think for me, that's kind of, I think there'll probably always be a role for philanthropy in some of those, but it would also be nice that it is a supportive role and not that they're the ones who are trying to fix the whole problem, because again, they work themselves out of a job. But you talk a little bit, oh, go ahead, Dave.
I just wanted to let everyone know, if you've got any questions, feel free to use the chat feature or raise your hand, or if you're confident enough, just unmute yourself and dive right in. I do have a few more questions.
Okay.
But before I change topics, I do think this is like one of the bigger issues for the next several decades, if not century, right? Like, what are our donations going to go to versus what issues is our government going to solve, if any?
Yeah.
Because one thing, whenever I hear that, like, your business plan should be to not exist anymore, which is, I've heard it's true for a lot of organizations, but like the theater, for instance, right? Like, I'll always want to see plays. Like, that's not a problem. Like, we'll never solve a problem where I don't want to see plays, right? So, and I think that's very, like, if it's right there, like, if we'll always have the need for it, right? And it's something the public likes doing, then very clearly it should pass. It's like, that's why theaters actually have a special little area on that complicated chart. Right? Also, colleges, universities, hospitals have another special area, right? Those are things that probably aren't going to like put themselves out of a job.
Yeah, actually, I know, Jane, you have a question, but can I jump in real quick? I think that because I used to work at the Penn Faulkner Foundation, literary arts, I agree with you. I'm like, oh yeah, we should still exist. People still want books. People still want to support authors. And so a part of the way that I tried to reframe it was, if we had all of the resources that we needed, right? And this is kind of speaking to that abundance mindset that a lot of people in philanthropy are also moving towards. If we have all the resources that we need, what is the kind of world that we would want to see? And I think part of the challenge is in making a case for support is being able to invite people into being part of that vision that you're creating. And so in terms of having a divide too between the public supporting nonprofits who are doing the work, I think we've seen examples of nonprofits that very much involve the public in the work that they're doing. So it's not just about, you're redistributing your resource, your time, your money to help us, but we are in this movement together, right? Like as part of a coalition, we have volunteers who kind of go out, canvass, knock on doors, sign petitions, things like that, who are actually the ones sorting food at a food bank, redistributing that. So I think taking that perspective is also really helpful in making sure that you're not just putting a stark line between who is giving the support and who is receiving it. But yes, Jane. Oh, you're muted. Jane, you're muted.
Yet again, mute.
No, I know. Sorry. Brain cramp. It seems to me that you're really getting up close to, especially in that, your goal should be to fade away. All I could think of was, wasn't that Marx's original thing that after the dictatorship of the proletariat, government would just sort of fade away. There wouldn't be any need for it. But you're also getting to the issue of, do you want to depend on the public to donate to support these things, or do you want to pay more taxes and have the government? Because you think of Canada where they pay larger taxes, but they also have a social safety net, like Scandinavian countries, in that they have national health care, university education is a lot cheaper. They have support for the arts. So, it sort of gets down to the question of, do you want to have a sort of a volunteer society to do that, or do you want the government to do it? And then, of course, you run the risk of, is the government going to dictate, what kind of arts we get, what kind of university education we get? I mean, it's a really tricky question. And I also was thinking recently of these, these lovely Southern governors who keep busing immigrants, to northern cities, and then you run into the question of whose responsibility is that? I mean, is it the government or I think of the the people who stepped up in Martha's Vineyard. I guess Ron DeSantis wasn't expecting that, but just sort of took over and took care of those people. And I mean, it's a really tricky question. I mean, and I guess it decides if and it gets to the issues that the guaranteed income people are dealing with. Because if we had a guaranteed income, it would sort of negate the need for some other programs that are taken care of both by government and by.
We have a significant Canadian funder from Ontario Trillium coming later. I was looking over her grant portfolio, and I noticed compared to an American funder of the same size, it's not nearly as many health organizations that she funds. And I was like, oh, yes, of course, because everyone has free healthcare.
Right.
And it's actually a very exciting grant portfolio as a result. And in fact, I don't know how everything works in Canada, but some of their funding is from those tax dollars. The government then says, all right, we're going to set up a little fund and hire professionals. Those professionals are going to get to know these community catalysts that Amanda was talking about, right, and give some funding to them. Trying to promo the later session, we have some very interesting international funders coming. They are from countries that are not the U.S., but we all do have the same founder. Yeah, you're like, thank you, Margaret.
As you're promoting future work, one potential, not answer, but relevant topic from some previous work is visiting our talk on the history of philanthropy.
Oh,
yes. I think some of that dovetails here with the concept of how philanthropy is solving these issues in the US versus in other countries, and why it's more acceptable here to have the private sector, the philanthropists work on some of these issues, where in other countries it did evolve differently, and the government evolved to support and fund these issues. So just want to put a plug in there for watching Pete Moss do a
Yes.
delightful
All
discussion.
these mosses do undermine our case for public support. But right, sharing the family knowledge bases has been a privilege. We get many nonprofits founded by families, and Unfunded list is no exception. This has been very interesting. Again, I want to encourage questions from the audience, but I have another one about storytelling, something that's come up for us as a challenge for some of our applicants. Right, so obviously some groups, stories are great. I forget the name of it, but there's a group that's in the catalog all the time. Andy, our photographer, used to take pictures for them. And it's like troubled teens building boats. And they have lots of pictures of like the teens like sanding boats, right? And like on the water, right? And these are great visuals, and the stories are quite nice. It's not always like that, depending on what you're doing. There are some organizations that, for various reasons, don't really want to tell their story, right? We've reviewed proposals from sex worker-led organizations, and we had the pitch competition featuring the lady who ran DC Rape Crisis Center, right? And so being like, well, tell the stories of your program recipients, right? It's like, can be a little off base. And as funders increasingly want to fund Black and Brown folks, right? Asking them to do a little storytelling before they can get the funding, right? I do think you run the risk of crossing some lines. What do you, and obviously in a city like DC, I think probably a very large proportion of Black and Brown founders dealing with some of the similar issues that, right, and a lot of them are the same folks in the catalog sending us proposals. Right, somebody needs funding. I just think it's a strange thing to be like, all right, well, here's some storytelling skill building trainings instead.
I'm gonna try to get to the question that was at the heart of what you shared. I think I definitely agree with the pieces that, storytelling can be an exploitative act, right? I think the way, at least for right now, the way in which I would attempt to determine how to go about navigating that is seeing who really has the agency in the story and in the act of storytelling. I think I am very inspired by the words of Grace Lee Boggs, who wrote in The Next American Revolution that really where we need to start in terms of changing, including changing ourselves, is to think of ourselves as the creative agent. So that's kind of where I try to get to the root of how you're telling a story, and inviting people to be part of that storytelling with you. So, there's definitely improvements that can be had to the way in which you ask for other stories, or even in the way in which you tell people what the suggested, practices are for storytelling, because there is a lot of, centering whiteness, right, in the way that people fill out applications, and exactly to what you spoke about, like, tell us your stories, right, in a way that's palatable to us, in a way that makes sense for how we're asking you in this format. So I think that there is like an ongoing kind of journey to make sure that that is something that we're not doing, but I think one of the things that we tried to experiment with this past year, as I've started to do more community engagement events with the catalog, we hosted an event that we called a Change Cafe. So we brought in 3 nonprofits in our network within a particular neighborhood, and we invited residents out in that neighborhood to have kind of like deep dive conversations about what the issues these nonprofits are dealing with are. Everybody kind of was led through a conversation menu of questions that we worked with each nonprofit to create. And that included nonprofits like the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens, where what they really wanted to talk about was the barriers to reentry, right? And a nonprofit like My Sister's Place, which empowers, survivors of domestic violence. And these are really hard issues to talk about. People don't really want to talk about them. There is a lot of trust that you need to build as you're trying to have conversations, even with survivors who come and who came and shared their stories. So I think what we learned through that process was really that people are interested in talking about these things. People want to get to the heart of what they don't know for themselves, and also where they think that they can relate in terms of their own experiences. It's not, it's not something that people at the very core of it necessarily want to shy away from. It's just a question of how you create that environment so that people feel comfortable sharing that. And those, how do you create an environment where people are also comfortable saying that they're wrong, saying that they've changed their minds, saying that they made a mistake? And that's how we continue to move this forward. I'm not quite sure if I did end up getting to the question that you were asking, Dave.
We don't have to necessarily answer. The point of a symposium is not necessarily to answer all of the questions, just to talk about them at great length. We've been doing that. Again, anyone feel free to chime in with questions. I just do have a few more. This is something I think about a lot. We get a lot of proposals. Some of them, right when I read them, like this is something that maybe should get private investment, or I don't know, but definitely not something that should be philanthropically funded. And in general, I don't have any real hard lines in there for it. And I do like the general idea behind the public support test. Right, like the fact that the public's supporting us and the various other facts and circumstances, like for me, say, right, this is a public organization currently serving a nice public need. The main thing that tells me that is like the folks that, right, come to us with proposals. And I would agree with what you said earlier. We are the first folks to give feedback to them. In many cases, right? This is the very first time they're hearing any kind of response to their grant proposals. They may have sent that grant proposal off to like 30 different places, right? And now for the very first time, they've received, right, some feedback on what they wrote. And this is a very important part of the process because of this, right? We are the public sector. They need to hear the perspectives of members of the public. I think my biggest takeaway, Amanda, from what you were talking about today was the sort of the community nature of these folks and the test, right? Like one way for sure, we should know that this is a public organization worthy of public support. It's like when it has community leaders and and lots of members of the community involved in it. And it's very real members of the community who have identified the problems being solved. DC is a little microcosm where you would very much run the risk, and this has happened in the past, of like your richest and fanciest citizens. And in DC, they are very rich and fancy, right? Like Mink stole at the Kennedy Center fancy, right? And right, you've also got people in absolute tremendous need, large homeless population right there in the nation's capital. And certainly you wouldn't want the like wealthiest citizens funding it, but that is like, and it is part of what's happening in philanthropy, and always will be. This is people with extra money donating, right? And so a little of it's going to be right. Some of it's going to come from a fancy lady. She may be wearing a mink stole. I think the catalog does really great work, right? Connecting, right, those two sides of town. And a lot of philanthropy is local. And a lot of your career, you've worked on local initiatives. Some of our folks in the audience, right, are from other countries, other continents, right? And there's a lot of American philanthropy and dollars that flow outward. Do you have any thoughts about international philanthropy? Right, because it's very hard to be connected to a community that you're like thousands of miles from, or maybe one you've never been to. I mean, I have very personal opinions and thoughts, sure, especially, because I'm not American. I have still honestly been learning a lot about how American politics works, let alone how, philanthropy in America works. Congratulations on not being American. I mean, one text that I would recommend in terms of, how it has informed me in thinking a little bit more about this is Against White Feminism. And in it, the author
touches on international development, international aid, and how that's not necessarily on its own like a decolonial project, actually kind of the opposite, right? So I will not hash out what I think that book states, because the way that they have written it is much more succinct. But I will say that, to what Jane was mentioning earlier, so much of how we talk about philanthropy, including in the sessions that are happening later today at the symposium too, when we talk about like equity of access, things like that, they're so specific to the American context, because this is not how philanthropy or civil society or the government operates in Singapore. Not that I'm a huge expert on that, right? I grew up there as a child, but I do know that civil society in Singapore does not work the same way in terms of having such, like you said, Dave, a large portion of healthcare nonprofits that need to be funded because there is no universal healthcare, things like that. So I am very curious, Margaret. I'm glad that you pointed to that other webinar that you talked about on the history of philanthropy, because I am very curious about how that compares. Yeah.
And we have some, in the suggested resources, there are some pretty good books on the history of philanthropy. They're both about the history of American philanthropy, but that is where the majority of dollars have been donated from. So, fundamentally, it's like, it's all process and tax law. The public support test specifically exists, right, because a tax law was passed in 1989, and they very specifically wanted to prevent, right, scams. Right? There's always been some sort of, you've always had to make some sort of rationale, and basically, and it's just the history of philanthropy is like the history of 6 or 7 legislative tax bills, right? That slowly over time set up the social sector. It is still evolving and could still change. We had some changes in the 2018 bill. And I imagine the catalog will continue to spread the word about the great work that's going on in the DC region.
Yeah, I mean,
we've been chatting for a while. Margaret, did you have any more questions on your list for Amanda?
No, I know one of the things that we wanted to kind of touch on, at least at some point, was something that Amanda and I talked about, and the idea that if you didn't pass the public support test, we talked a lot about the complicated, math that goes into it and why it's there and all of those various things. And Amanda brought up another symposium webinar that we've done previously on the models of social formation. And I do just want to point out that, sometimes when you do the math, it comes out to a percentage lower than 10%, right? And so it looks like, oh, we didn't pass this test. And there are implications for that. We talked about them a little earlier. You could lose the ability to have tax deductible donations. You could have to pay additional taxes. You'll be a private foundation. These are all not necessarily the worst things that could happen to you as an organization. If you watch the other one, you'll note that there are over 20 different types of entity that you could become, that you could still do good work in the world and not have C3 next to your name and not have to, pass this test. And so I just want to, and Amanda and I talked a little bit about it, and I'm sure she has a couple of thoughts on it too, that she's seen from her side. But just the idea that, yes, you might not pass the test. And that may mean that instead of being a 501c3, maybe you are better serving the population that you're trying to help by being a C4, by being a private foundation, by being a for-profit entity. We tell the story in that webinar about the coffee that was originally a nonprofit that tried very hard to go after donations and grant funding and all the things to support refugees, and it just didn't work. There wasn't traction. It wasn't working out the way he thought it would. He would never have passed a public support test, most likely, if it had gotten to that point. But it turned into a for-profit entity, which is now huge and has ventured into water and a handful of other things that they can sell for a profit, and the profits go back to the people he was trying to serve in the beginning. So I just want to, have that conversation for just, 2 minutes, because we talk about all the intricacies of trying to pass it, and does this number go here or there, and what happens? But at the end of the day, what happens if you don't pass it? And that may mean that you're better serving your population in another way. So I'm curious, Amanda, what we talked a little bit about this on a call, so I'm curious at your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I found your models of social formation, the distinction that you make between what your business model is versus like what your legal model is, really important to clarify. And I mean, what's coming to mind right now as an example of good that's not necessarily a 501c3, there is a giving circle in the DMV collective network of giving circles called the Awesome Foundation. So they have chapters worldwide. There is a local chapter here in DC who I've gotten to know, and they every month or 10 months out of the year essentially fund any project, any applicant that applies with a great idea to do good, and they just give $1,000 based on kind of a democratic voting process. And they've given to people who have wanted to, take flowers from a community garden that they've planted to give to senior citizens in the neighborhood, just because that's an awesome neighborly thing to do, right? Like, you can fund projects like that. You can do that. And it doesn't have to be a 501c3. I think kind of related to this too, when we think about impact, especially as it relates to public support, the thing that usually comes to mind is, okay, how big, how broad, how much can we go? And something that I really appreciate having learned at the Catalogue, and also from another author and thinker, Adrienne Maree Brown, she has a book called Emergent Strategy. And one of the principles of emergent strategy, she talks about small is all. And that's really what I've been trying to embody even in my day-to-day life, that you don't always have to think about change on a super large scale. So much of it starts with who you are, how you see the world, who the people are around you. Even for those people who aren't looking to live in DC or in any city for a long time, if you start by thinking about how you want to engage in your life and in, the communities that are around you, that is something that, as you change, can be replicable to everywhere else that you go to. So I think thinking in that sense too, making sure that you're not just framing like the bigger the better, right? Hence international, let's go that way. So I think there's definitely benefits to not doing that.
Oh, I love that. Small is all. Oh.
Yeah.
And I think that goes to what a lot of our messaging has been too, is that everyone can be a philanthropist. And one more throwback to an older Unfunded list series that is probably still on the website are the giving stories of talking to people what their first gift was. And some of them are just, the smallest gift. They made a present for their mom. They gave someone $5, and that really set them on a path of giving for their whole lives. And that stood out to them, and it was small, and it was the first thing they remember doing. So I do love that idea that small is all. I'm gonna start using that. Thank you.
It is a common issue that we see with first-time proposals, right? Going for too much, covering far too many issues. Many funders are looking for like very specific focus. And a lot of people, I think, Margaret, what was the thing you used to say? Are you going to crush my dreams?
Are you going to crush my dreams?
Because there's some people, their dream is just they want to start a nonprofit, and they went with the best idea they could come up with. Their dream is to start a nonprofit, though, right? And they should probably go find a good nonprofit and work there instead of starting with them. So very fashionable to be a founder. Shark Tank, still one of the bigger shows on television, I hear. And influences a lot of the culture around this. Not necessarily that glamorous. One thing that we are going to be talking about in both of the sessions later that is very applicable to this public sector is that the leaders in this sector are burning out at a pretty alarming rate. I read recently it's like 75% of nonprofit executive directors are planning to leave their jobs, and 60% feel burned out or used up. I personally have felt both of those things many times in my nonprofit career, and I've left many of the jobs I had at nonprofits. Is there, and I know this happens in the DC area, staff retention or burnout, right? What do we, like I said, we definitely, this is coming up in our next session, and we're going to ask our funders to share what they're doing about it as well. But you talk to a lot of folks, getting new nonprofits off the ground, trying to help them, right, doing some support building for them. What do you think about this?
I'm glad that you touched on that. And I know that it's going to be touched on later in the sessions too, which I'm very grateful for, because we also do kind of a regular survey of the executive directors leading the nonprofits in our network. And we have similarly seen, you know, we've been doing this since the pandemic started. And right now, a lot of the responses that we got in our most recent survey back in the summer indicate that executive directors have basically been kind of taking on the bulk of all of the extra work that needed to happen during the pandemic.
Oh, have they?
And yeah, and honestly, at this
No,
point, the burnout is also it's also very much cumulative, right? It's not just like a one zap, everything
they're
is
very real comments you make. I feel them physically.
right, because I mean, so many times in the nonprofit sector, you're kind of expected to run on like passion. And I know that there's this whole, you know, debate that's happening about the overhead myth and how that shows up in funding or how people think about Margaret, you're like, don't even get me started on that. But yeah, I mean, when you have kind of so much on your plate in terms of managing your staff, making sure that your services are still running, making sure that you're communicating to funders and continuing to be able to do your work and offer the services that you do, like there are so many people who just have not taken time off, right? Who have started families during the pandemic and haven't taken time off. And that's sort of the thing that people don't really think about as they're kind of coming back into it and being like, okay, so tell me more about how you've grown during the pandemic or how you've expanded your services. And it's like, oh, also we're people and we're tired and the tiredness grows. So I think that's definitely something that's super important to touch on.
Mm-hmm. You know, I know for me, it's never been so much about vacation. I don't necessarily mind working a lot, but like it would be nice to be able to focus on the job. There's when I started my nonprofit career, The Wire was a new television show. So anyway, you can go do the math on that if you want to figure out how old I am. And I remember there's a great line from it. And it was, I was working at a nonprofit and one of the cops says, oh, I wonder what it's like to work in a real police department. Right? Because he keeps getting to a position where he could arrest the criminal and then he doesn't get the resources he needs to do it. Right? Or he keeps running into roadblocks. Right? It's not like no amount of vacations or time off or leaving on time. Alleviate those sorts of the gut punch from like you did your job well but nothing happened anyway, right? Perfectly fine with extra hours, right? Being exhausted and all of that, like because we signed up for the impact. That's when you're like fundamentally unable to have it because of the lack of resources. Personally, for me, and from some of the folks I've heard from as well. Which reminds me of my earlier point. If you want to help us with our resources, you can make a donation to the Unfunded list. In a moment, I'll let my panelists make some closing remarks. But I think we've had a successful conversation about what it means to make the case for public support. Hopefully it's been helpful for our panelists. We will come back at 3 o'clock with nonprofit nuts and bolts. Got Chandler Arnold and Unfunded list board member Ashley LaHood coming, and we're going to talk about the day-to-day work for nonprofit folks, which includes Amanda. So I imagine this will be very relevant for you. And then at the end of that session, we make some recommendations to funders. And then later today, our funders are going to come and talk about those recommendations and what it's like to administer generosity at a massive scale. Anyway, I think the symposium is off to a great start. Hope everybody agrees. Margaret and Amanda, let's hear, what are your closing thoughts for today's session? You are both muted at the moment.
Sure, I'll start. First of all, thanks everyone for coming. And I hope that we clarified a couple of the pieces as much as we could of the public support test. It is incredibly complex, convoluted, and I wish you all the best of luck as you're working on your 990s the first part of next year. So good luck with that. And definitely, if you have any questions or if you have resources that you find that you think we would be interested to know about, let us know, because we're always collecting new data on this topic, especially. So please share those if you come across them, because I, for one, would love to read them. If you learn things that I can then learn too. That's the first of our, or second of our motto, the listen, the learn. So we've all listened a little bit, and I'm happy to learn more from all of you. So thanks for joining. And Amanda, yeah.
You summed it up pretty much perfectly, I will say. Learned a lot during this session as I was listening to you. Also already have a whole list started for things that I want to continue looking into. So as Margaret mentioned, I'm going to drop my email into the chat if anybody would like to get in touch and or just have more thoughts or resources that you want. Absolutely happy to do that. I've had a really great time. Thank you again for inviting me. I feel very sad that I'm not going to be able to join the sessions later in real time, but I do know Dave mentioned at the very beginning, this is being recorded. So I'm looking forward to being able to hear what all the other panelists have to say today. Thank you.
Great. And thank you again to David Jaffe for said recording. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which is in 34 minutes.